Now, I've been following various channels on evolutionary psychology and its effects on the male-female dynamic for quite a few years. This also includes channels from the so-called manosphere and the larger community associating themselves with a pill of a particular color, which to me represents the willingness to question your formerly unquestioned beliefs and the willingness to accept some uncomfortable conclusions that you might discover in the process. I've tried to identify the overlapping, repeatedly occurring ideas and integrate them into a common framework, a simple visualization which I call the L model. The core idea behind this model is that romantic relationships aren't strictly reciprocal. Instead, they represent a unidirectional flow of resources, protection, affection, caregiving, and many other benefits. A flow that runs from a man to a woman and from the woman to her children. As parts of this flow, both men and women make sacrifices for the ultimate benefits of their children. This framework makes three core assumptions. First, it is based on the idea of the selfish gene or self-promoting gene. You as a human being are essentially just a vessel that carries a particular set of genes from one generation to the next. While this mortal shell will eventually die inevitably, the genes themselves have a chance to survive by continuously making their carriers create new hosts for themselves. Second, the model assumes unidirectionality for different types of phenomena. Some things will move down the model, i.e. from a man to a woman to a child, while other things will move up the model, i.e. from a child to a woman to a man. In either case, the claim is that a given thing will only ever move either down or up, never in both directions. Thus, it assumes unidirectionality, not reciprocity. Third, the top and the bottom parts of the model, that is, the man-woman dynamic and the mother-child dynamic, are assumed to be largely independent of one another. The male-female dynamic will play out even in the absence of a child, and the mother-child dynamic can play out even in the absence of a father. Let's start with the selfish gene. If we are driven to act in such a way that our genes have the best chance of survival, then it makes sense for a man to sacrifice his life for a woman, if he has reason to assume she might be carrying his offspring, i.e. if she has slept with him at least once. It also makes sense for a woman to sacrifice her life for her child or children, whether already born or unborn. The latter would mean dying in childbirth. And of course it would also make sense for a man to sacrifice his life for his child or children, meaning if he sacrifices his life to save his possibly pregnant wife, he would be saving his children by proxy. These types of sacrifices are evolutionarily viable because they help the genes of everyone involved survive, even if the individual body containing these genes dies. Consequently, human beings who practice this type of behavior should have had more reproductive success than those who didn't. And since we are the offspring of everyone whose genes have survived so far, we can expect ourselves to have those same instincts. In contrast, it does not make sense for a child to sacrifice its life for either or both parents, nor does it make sense for, and here comes the critical part, a woman to sacrifice her life for a man. Because any woman who does so not only eliminates her own genes from the pool, but also those of any children she might possibly be carrying at the moment. Even though her male partner would survive in the short term, in order for his genes to survive to the next generation, he would have to find a new female partner first, and the whole cycle would simply repeat. Consequently, since any woman who may have sacrificed herself in the past to save her husband eliminated her own genes from the pool in doing so, the genetic predisposition for this type of behavior will have been eliminated along with them. From this asymmetry, men being willing to sacrifice themselves for women, but not vice versa, arises the next assumption, which is unidirectionality, or at least non-reciprocity. Some things will only ever flow down the model. These include lots of benefits such as resources and protection. Usually the person providing these benefits does not expect an equal return because the giver feels quote-unquote unconditional love for the receiver. It is obvious to parents that their child throughout its adolescence will not be able to give them back any of the money, time and effort they put into raising that child. Likewise, if a woman deliberately chooses a man as a partner who earns more money than she does, which is usually the case, he will contribute more to the household income than she does, so that she receives more than she gives herself. The downside of being protected and provided for by somebody else is that it usually goes along with at least some degree of patronization. Parents take care of their children, but they also have quite a bit of authority over them. The child is in a position where some of its freedoms are being sacrificed for its security. It's trapped in a golden cage. For the longest time, women were in a similar position compared to their husbands. It is only in recent decades that this authority of a man over his wife has started to fade, and has pretty much evaporated in Western societies by now. For the things flowing down the model, the father will be the ultimate giver, the child will be the end receiver, and the mother is the one mediating between the two. If she requests more resources from her husband, like getting a better paying job or selling off some of his valuable assets for the benefits of the family, this behavior on the woman's part will often not be regarded as selfish, because we can assume that her children will benefit by proxy. For the things that flow up the model, we have to basically ask ourselves, what does the husband get from his wife and children in return, and what does a mother get from her children? Gratitude? Respect? Obedience? Many would like to think so, and many parents might indeed receive those things from the children in some form. However, it's of course much less reliable. Children will always be able to point to the fact that they didn't ask to be born, that they didn't even have a say in whether they would be sired or not. Especially young children can therefore feel entitled to their parents' love and care, and protection to a certain degree. After all, they are a problem that their parents brought upon themselves. Thus, the parents will always be somewhat responsible for the children's behavior, even when they are grown-ups, because the way they were raised will still affect them. This in turn allows the children to always shift the blame for the problems onto the parents. Immature? Maybe, but also technically not wrong. Now, content creators from the manosphere will frequently point out a similar behavior of women towards men. Female entitlement to male resources, protection and services, as well as men being blamed for all kinds of different problems in women's lives. This behavior may of course stem from former times when, just like children can't decide if they want to be born and to which parents, women had much less freedom in deciding whether they wanted to marry and whom they would be married to. Nor did they have much control, both physiologically and socially, over whether, when, and how often they would get pregnant or not. She was expected to fulfill her marital duties according to her husband's sexual needs. Thus, a husband had much more authority over his wife back in those days, and as Spider-Man's Uncle Ben said, with great power comes great responsibility. Whoever is responsible is also the one to ultimately get the blame. Now, in the modern day and age, most of this power has shifted away from the husband, and specifically with regards to procreational choices, I'd even argue that particular kind of power is solely in women's hands right now, which is a topic for another video. However, the ultimate responsibility still remains with the husband, and therefore he will also be the end receiver of the blame if things go south. Maybe Uncle Ben should have added the inverse of his wisdom too: never take responsibility for something which you have no power over. Now, you may have noticed that the bottom end of the model is hidden in the dark. One reason for this is that I simply couldn't find a unanimously agreed upon symbol for child as they exist for male and female. On second thought though, this seemed quite fitting, because it doesn't actually matter what is on the bottom end of the model. The male-female dynamic remains intact even if the couple doesn't have any children. And in the modern day and age, especially in Western countries, removing the child from the equation has never been easier, especially for women. Therefore, the dark bottom side of the model now serves to illustrate this assumption of independence. It's not supposed to represent dark times or anything some of the doomsayers in the manosphere might say. It simply means what happens down there, literally, doesn't really matter. The important part, that is, the dynamic between the adults, still carries out as normal. If you remove the child from the equation, a woman can indeed become the end recipient of all the resource and protection benefits the man is providing to her without having a bad conscience about it. Because the reason she would normally pass on these benefits to her children is not a bad conscience towards her male partner, it's just that she falls as helplessly in love with her children as her male partner falls in love with her. And that would be because oxytocin is involved in both types of bonding, i.e. the romantic and the parental one. Consequently, a mother will have no problem taking resources from the father. In fact, many don't even seem to be aware they're doing it. That not only joint bank accounts for couples, but also the welfare state will always entail at least some degree of redistribution of wealth from men to women. If for no other reason than hypergamy, meaning that she selected a husband who makes more money than she does to begin with. But then, once the children are there, most mothers worth their salt will simply not be able to help themselves. They will pass on at least a good portion of the material benefits they gain from their male partners to their children, simply because they love them. Now that we have established the model, we can start applying it to explain some of the phenomena commonly discussed in the manosphere in its terms, and I'll simply provide a short written overview here. Once you've internalized this framework as a lens through which you can perceive the world, you may find yourself becoming calmer about certain injustices of the world. And this can apply to both people coming at this from a manosphere perspective and to people approaching it from a feminist perspective. You will no longer feel the need to point out obvious hypocrisy and double standards between the ways men and women are treated by society. You might actually get tired of doing it, because it seems pointless as soon as this simple image pops back into your mind. The unidirectionality assumption is one reason why I like to claim that most double standards are actually reverse standards, meaning it's the same standard applied to men and women in opposite ways, like two sides of the same coin. Even if you can point out such a double standard on a purely rational level, you will realize that in order to neutralize such a double standard, people will always have to override their instincts using nothing but willpower, which, just like everything else, is a limited resource, and therefore overpowering those instincts will fail more often than it does work. Now, I'm not saying fall for biological determinism to the point of being fatalistic. There are certainly many cases in which we absolutely should try to override our instincts, because they are no longer as helpful of a tool in our modern civilized environment as they were in the primordial environment they evolved in. What I'm saying is that we need to be aware of which battles against our nature are worth fighting, in the sense that we have a realistic chance of winning them, and which are not. In this particular case, the drives governing mate selection and procreation are arguably the strongest ones human beings have, sometimes even outweighing the drive to self-preservation. As outlined before, as one human being on the upper side of the L model will sacrifice themselves to protect somebody who is lower on the L model in comparison. Now, even though I'm hyperbolically calling this model my theory of everything in my song Bastion of the Divine, it obviously isn't perfect. Here are some things the model can't explain that easily, at least not without making additional assumptions. For example, the model describes why the individual woman's life is valued more highly than that of the individual man, as is evident by things such as mandatory military service for men and women and children first when it comes to lifeboats on a sinking ship. But if the reason for that is the fact that she can have children, then you would consequently expect the child's life to be valued even more highly than that of its mother, which would mean that, when in doubt, society would expect the mother to sacrifice her life to give birth to the child, just like it expects men to sacrifice their lives to protect their wives and children. However, as we can clearly see from abortion laws around the world, this is not the case. Even in the most conservative countries, abortion is permitted, even if for no other reason, if the woman's life is in danger. The only countries in which it is illegal without exceptions are Honduras, Nicaragua, and the Vatican. Thus, it's safe to say humanity at large would rather sacrifice an individual unborn child than sacrificing the woman who could have it. And even on a purely cynical mathematical level, this makes sense. A woman does not only represent the child she is currently pregnant with, but also any and all further children she could still have in the future. So obviously, humans would have evolved to rather crack a single egg than losing the golden goose that lays it. The second big topic, which is another thing deserving of its own video, is the so-called male mother need. I think this model illustrates quite clearly in a drastic visual manner why, as for example Alexander Grace has pointed out repeatedly, women usually hate having to mother their husbands, a sentiment commonly expressed in the statement that they ain't your mother. This is in line with the model, as a woman assuming maternal responsibilities for a husband would go against the flow described by the model. But why then did men evolve to have male mother need in the first place if it should be such an obvious disadvantage for being selected as a mate? Well, you find my attempt at an explanation here on screen, and I certainly plan to go into much more detail about this in a future video. For now, let's just say male mother need is an instinct we guys evolved to have, not because it has ever actually been fulfilled, but simply because it did a good enough job at motivating us to seek out a partner. Once we had done our duty in the game of nature, nature could care about our personal happiness as much as it cares about anything else, which is not at all, because nature obviously is not a sentient entity. Then there are the less frequent cases of what I would summarize as non-romantic sacrifices. Those include genuine altruism. That is something I believe we can really only explain in terms of it helps the survival of the human species as a whole, rather than our individual genes. As well as, for example, an older sibling sacrificing or at least risking their life for a younger one. And I've listed fictional stories such as The Brothers Lionheart and The Hunger Games here as examples, so spoilers ahead for these two books, you've been warned. Brothers Lionheart is the easier example because an older brother sacrificing himself for a younger one is akin to a parent, the more grown-up one, the caretaker, the provider, sacrificing themselves for the kids. Except that in Brothers Lionheart it's ultimately pointless from an evolutionary perspective because the older brother is healthy at the time of his death, whereas the younger one is terminally ill. And thus they both end up dying and traveling onto the fantasy afterlife of Nangiala, which is, where the main part of the plot actually plays. The Hunger Games, meanwhile, does a really good job at illustrating the unidirectionality assumption of the L model. Katniss volunteers for the Hunger Games to save her little sister, Primrose, from being drafted as a tribute. And let's just say that the narrative power is strengthened by it being her little sister. If it had been a little brother, the situation would immediately become more ambiguous, because a woman would be risking her life for a man. Now, of course, Katniss does the latter as well. She has to save her fellow tribute, Peter Malark, several times. Except that he's also being set up as a love interest, and most viewers perceive him as a total loser, because Katniss is always the one who has to save him. It makes absolutely no sense that she ends up in a relationship with him instead of the much more masculine candidate Gale, except for the fact that Gale screws up big time at one point in the third book and does something that Katniss can never forgive him. That kind of makes him the bad boy, and yeah, the bad boy she has to leave behind, and Peter the beta provider she has to settle for. So yeah, as you see, most of these things can still be explained by the model to some extent, but you need to go to some extra lengths to do it. You need to accept the premises of the model first, and then start expanding on them. Some final disclaimers before I wrap this up. Obviously, this is just a descriptive depiction of all the things I've gathered from the Manosphere in the past years. I haven't collected any data on this or run any psychological experiments on this. You certainly could come up with specific hypotheses and predictions that you could test, and I've made a couple in this video. But yeah, most of these predictions revolve around human beings sacrificing their lives, or at least their well-being, for others, so no chance to actually execute that. Ethics committees for scientific studies do exist for a reason. And then the last point I want to stress is that I'm making generalized statements here, yes, but not universal statements. I'm not claiming that cases of children sacrificing themselves for their parents, women sacrificing themselves for their husbands, etc. can never occur. I'm just stating that evolution can be expected to have selected against those behavioral tendencies. They still pop up every now and then, because evolution is constantly trying stuff. Therefore, people who possess genuine altruistic characteristics certainly still exist. However, the chances of you encountering one of them are so very slim that you could hardly call it rational to base your decisions or even your hopes on that small likelihood. It's kind of like the statement, there is extraterrestrial life. That is almost certainly true, but it's also most likely that they're so far away from us, both spatially and temporally, that neither of us will ever get to meet the other. That's about it for this video. If you want to hear more, I will point you to 2 of my songs that I've already uploaded on this channel, both of which explore the ramifications of this L model a little further. Bastion of the Divine is a song that basically equates our romantic ideas of relationships with a form of religion, and describes how we have now started to rationally dismantle and disenchant it, just like we in the secular parts of the world have done with actual religions in the past. Messenger is a song about women's position in the middle of the L model and their role of conveying the needs of the child to the father and to society at large. It also describes how women can still retain that role even if they don't have children themselves, which is the independence assumption I explained earlier in this video. Messenger is an acoustic guitar ballad and therefore probably quite accessible on a musical level. Bastion of the Divine is more of a melodic / power metal thing along the lines of bands like Stratovarius, Dragon Force and such. For now, I thank you all for listening. As always, feel free to disprove my claims in the comments down below, and see you all next time.